G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. This is ABC Radio National interviewing Bill Gammage, who wrote The Greatest Estate on Earth.
I don't know how that notion came about. I know some early exponents of it, but I don't know how the notion that painters were romanticising the landscape and therefore...
That's a very common notion, though.
It is very common. In fact, I would say it was virtually universal. But in fact, in England, you can go to where Constable painted, for example, and recognise the scene. And why people assumed it was otherwise in Australia, I don't know. But in fact, you can go to where people painted and match the scene then and now and see that they are the same place in quite precise detail. The big thing that's changed is the vegetation, particularly the trees.
So what we had in 1788 in this country, before the arrival of white settlers, was a land that was incredibly well tended. Now,
that's true.
And yeah. Tell us a little of how that happened and to what ends and the sort of landscapes that were created.
Well, I speculate on exactly how it came about, but one of the obvious facts about Australia is that 70% of its plant species either tolerate or need fire to regenerate. And that's a problem for any human beings, especially with the volatility of eucalypts and so on. And basically what Aboriginal people did was ally with eucalypts and join that alliance, the Eucalypt Fire Alliance, to manage the landscape. And the first thing they were doing was controlling fuel. Then one way to control fuel is to break up the most flammable plants, that is scrub and eucalypt forest and so on, and you break it up by making grassland. When you do that, you can see all sorts of other advantages. For example, grassland promotes tubers and orchids and so on, in other words, all kinds of plant foods. But as well, you can make that grassland, put good grass on it, and then burn patches of it to attract kangaroos and other grazing animals. And gradually you can see from that perception, which is really a remarkable insight, you can build up the country so that you can put your kangaroos in one place by attracting them with grass. You can put the koalas in another place by burning to bring on fresh leaves. You can create grassland where you chase or deter kangaroos from coming for yam tubers and bulbs and so on. And basically you can organise a country so you've got all the resources that are possible, but as well as that you've got them put in, distributed closely and conveniently and therefore predictably. And that's an immense advantage. It means that hunter-gatherers who, we commonly thought of them as leaving camp and wandering around on the off chance of finding some kangaroos or whatever it may be. In fact, they knew exactly where the kangaroos would be. They'd go and get them.
There's a liberty involved here. That's right. Yeah. Well calculated.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing here too. I mean, this was a landscape created in this way over a great period of time, and one that then set the Aboriginal people in a position where this was the thing that could be sustained, that this was a condition of the Australian landscape that could be, it didn't need to be advanced from this point. It was a thing which ticked over in a reliable way that provided the necessities of life.
Yes, I suppose there are variations according to climate changes in climate, whether it's a drought or a flood, and there'd be variations from year to year if one species was in trouble and needed more help. But the basic system could continue, and it's enforced by the religion. Basically, the totem system or the skin system is a means of ensuring that there are human specialists for every conceivable species. I had a friend in Central Australia whose skin was the maggots. That's an English translation, but basically the grubs of flies and spit grubs and so on. And his job was to make sure that there was a habitat that suited those. So every species is looked after, and that becomes a religious obligation, which is the costs of defying that were too terrible to contemplate. So that effectively kept the system going.
this has always been an awkward thing, I think, for a lot of white Australians to grapple with this connection with land, connection with country that Aboriginal Australians speak of. But in that sort of detail, with that sort of roles and responsibilities, it starts to have a sort of a clarity.
Yes, well, of course, white Australians and Europeans generally come with all sorts of preconceptions, and one is that hunter-gatherers are more primitive than we are, and another is that hunter-gatherers really have no impact on the land, as the Sydney Morning Herald used to say, and therefore have no entitlement to it. That terra nullius was typical of Aboriginal societies, not only in Australia but worldwide. And they're preconceptions which have proved very hard to overcome. I mean, basically, some people still have them. They mightn't talk about terra nullius now, but they talk about wilderness, as though wilderness has always existed in Australia, whereas Aboriginal people say there never was a wilderness. It was always controlled.
And that's a challenging concept, I think, from your work, that a lot of the country that we now think of as being the untouched bush of Australia is in fact overgrown, weed-infested lands that have run to ruin.
Yes, I agree entirely. There are great areas where Aboriginal people themselves, especially in the north, where they know the before and after, will say that while they were away, country's gone wild, and that's a matter of great grief. And we can see ourselves in southeast Australia and southwest Australia, dense forest, which is highly flammable, which moves into urban suburbs and destroys houses and people and so on, which at the time Europeans came was open forest with relatively little fuel in it, and which fire was controlled, so that those huge fires simply didn't exist. I mean, if they did exist, they would have destroyed Aboriginal people in those areas, because you can't run from things like Black Saturday.
As we know,
Yeah, and therefore they couldn't have existed. Those Black Saturdays couldn't have happened.
I mean, the other part of this too, as much as Aboriginal people created, if you like, a sort of especially in eastern and southeastern Australia, sort of a pastoral circumstance for the native fauna. Equally, that could be converted to ideal circumstances for sheep and cattle. No wonder the place took off in that way.
Yeah, it's a great irony that the most obvious landscape management was to put good grass on the best soil and next to it open forest in order to attract grazing animals. And of course that's exactly what Europeans brought, grazing animals. So that when we think of the new arrivals dispossessing Aborigines, we miss the extent of that. Those new arrivals landed on the heartland of Aboriginal people, the key places, the best places for grazing animals, because that were the best places for their sheep and cattle. So the dispossession was much more violent and damaging than even we conceive today.
Bill, thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Bill Gammage is Adjunct Professor and Senior Research Fellow, Humanities Research Centre of the Australian National University, and author of The Biggest Estate on Earth.
Okay, so you've now heard the word from the bloke who wrote the book. And like he said, kangaroos really like short green grass with its high nitrogen content. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Sorry about the shaky camera work and the impromptu nature of this film, but I thought you needed to hear that, fella. Ciao.